Ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest strategies of the enemy is not destruction, it's distraction. Because if he can't destroy you, he'll settle for distracting you. And if you're distracted, you won't fulfill the assignment God placed on your life. That's how the enemy operates. He doesn't always show up with horns and a pitchfork. He's subtle, slick, and strategic. He doesn't need to wreck your life with a storm when he can just get you to look the other way. See, God has a plan, a kingdom agenda tailor-made for your life. But the enemy knows he can't take that plan from you. So instead, he tries to get you to take your eyes off it. If he can distract your attention, delay your obedience, or distort your perspective, he can keep you going in circles instead of stepping into your calling. The enemy knows he can't remove God's calling on your life, so his primary tactic is to keep you from seeing it clearly. He works overtime trying to blur your spiritual vision so you don't recognize the path God has laid out for you. And one of his favorite tools is distraction. Distraction is not just a side issue, it's a deliberate strategy. It is the devil's way of taking your eyes off what matters most by placing seemingly urgent, attractive, or overwhelming things in your line of sight. You might not even recognize the moment you got off course, because it didn't happen through a dramatic fall. It happened through 1,000 small detours that didn't look like a threat, but each one shifted your gaze just a little further from where it needed to be. When you understand that you are part of something bigger than yourself, you begin to see why the enemy targets you. The purpose of distraction is to separate you from your assignment. If he can get you tied up in the worries of this world, the noise of social media, the pursuit of approval, the exhaustion of business, or the pain of offense, he can keep you stuck in spiritual paralysis. You'll still be moving, but you won't be going anywhere meaningful. You'll still be active, but not effective. That's exactly how the enemy wants it. He doesn't care if you're working hard, serving faithfully, or even doing ministry. As long as you're not doing what God specifically called you to do, distraction can look like something noble, respectable, or beneficial. That's why it's so dangerous. The enemy used this tactic on Eve in the garden. She was surrounded by abundance, purpose, and divine presence. But the serpent didn't attack her physically, he distracted her mentally. He got her to focus on the one tree she couldn't touch, rather than the thousands she could enjoy. That's how distraction works. It pulls your focus away from what God has said and gets you preoccupied with what He hasn't. Instead of walking in gratitude, you start walking in doubt. Instead of moving forward in faith, you pause to entertain fear, frustration, and confusion. And that's when the enemy makes his move. He waits until your focus is off before he delivers the lie that leads you astray. He also used distraction on Jesus. In the wilderness, the enemy came not with a sword but with suggestions. He tried to shift Jesus' attention from the Father's voice to earthly cravings, from divine timing to immediate satisfaction. The enemy tried to get Jesus to prove himself, to turn stones into bread, to leap from the temple. All distractions from the mission. But Jesus kept his focus by anchoring himself in the Word. Every temptation was answered not with emotion but with Scripture. That's how you fight distraction. You don't fight it with willpower alone. You fight it with truth. Because when your mind is filled with truth, the lies don't stick as easily. The enemy is not just after your comfort, he's after your clarity. Because if you don't see clearly, you won't move intentionally. You'll wander instead of walk. You'll react instead of respond. You'll settle for good when God has called you to great. That's why focus is a spiritual discipline. It's not just a productivity hack, it's warfare. Your focus determines your fruitfulness. And the enemy knows that if he can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. He'll overload your calendar, stir up unnecessary drama, feed your insecurities, and exhaust your emotional energy, just to keep you too tired to pray, too distracted to listen, and too hurried to obey. One of the most subtle forms of distraction is unresolved pain. The enemy loves to keep you stuck in cycles of offense, bitterness, and disappointment. If he can keep you rehearsing the past, he can rob you of your present. You can't walk into your future looking backward. He wants to keep you focused on who hurt you, what didn't work out, how far behind you feel. Because the longer you stay stuck there, the less you can see what God is doing now. Distraction isn't just about what grabs your attention. It's about what steals your intention. When your attention is divided, your purpose gets diluted. And when your purpose gets diluted, your destiny gets delayed. That's why the enemy is constantly throwing things at you. Not because you're weak, but because you're valuable. You're a threat to the kingdom of darkness, and the way he neutralizes a threat is through distraction. If he can keep you off mission, he doesn't need to take your life. He'll just drain it of meaning. Distraction is most effective when it feels like a natural part of life. The enemy doesn't always come at you with a pitchfork and horns. Sometimes he shows up in your schedule, your phone, your entertainment, your relationships, and your ambitions. He packages distraction in things that look harmless or even helpful. That's why it's so dangerous, because it doesn't always feel like a spiritual attack. It feels like normal life. But beneath that surface is a strategy to keep you off balance, spiritually dull, and emotionally overwhelmed. The enemy is subtle. He doesn't need to convince you to turn your back on God. He just needs to keep you preoccupied long enough that you stop listening to God. He wants to deaden your spiritual senses so that even when God is speaking, you're too distracted to hear. He knows that your attention is powerful. Wherever your attention goes, your heart follows. If he can shift your attention, he can slowly shift your affection. That's why Proverbs tells us to guard our hearts, because out of it flows everything else. But you can't guard what you're not watching. And if your eyes are on the wrong things, your heart will follow behind without resistance. Distraction doesn't just steal time. It steals affection. It creates a gap between you and the one who gives you purpose. The more distracted you are, the easier it is to drift. And drifting is always dangerous because it's gradual. It's not obvious until you've moved far away from where you started. The enemy often uses good things to distract from the best things. He knows you're not going to fall for obvious sin, so he offers you substitutes. He presents options that seem productive, opportunities that seem exciting, and ideas that seem important, all while pulling you further from your God-given priorities. You begin to say yes to everything and no to the most important things. You begin to serve in ways that stretch you too thin, to hustle for affirmation, to pour out without being poured into. Before long, you're burnt out, frustrated, and spiritually empty. Not because you're not doing anything, but because you're doing too much of what doesn't matter. The enemy doesn't mind your activity as long as it isn't attached to divine purpose. And the more tired you are, the easier it becomes for distraction to take root. Fatigue creates openings for deception. When you're emotionally and spiritually drained, your ability to discern drops. You begin to entertain thoughts and choices that you normally wouldn't consider. That's why rest isn't optional, it's spiritual warfare. When you rest, you regain clarity. And when you regain clarity, you can recognize distraction for what it really is, an attempt to derail you from God's assignment. The enemy would rather see you worn out and running in circles than rested and moving forward with focus. Because when you're focused, you're dangerous. When you're focused, you're effective. But when you're distracted, you're vulnerable. He doesn't just distract you with things around you. He distracts you with thoughts inside you. He floods your mind with what-ifs, with fears, with regrets, with lies. He whispers that you're not good enough, that you're too late, that it's too hard, that it won't work. And if you dwell on those thoughts long enough, they begin to feel like truth. That mental distraction creates emotional confusion. It clouds your decision-making. You second guess what God already confirmed. You delay obedience because you're paralyzed by doubt. You hesitate when you should move. You shrink back when you should step forward. And all of that stems from the enemy's strategy to distract not just your hands but your mind. The battlefield isn't always visible. Most of the time it's in the quiet corners of your life. It's in the unnoticed compromises, the unchecked emotions, the quiet moments when you choose scrolling over scripture, gossip over grace, reacting over praying. These are the places where distraction does its deepest damage. It doesn't just interrupt your routine, it shifts your alignment. Suddenly, you're trying to do life in your own strength, leaning on your own understanding, managing your own stress, and wondering why peace feels so far away. That's because distraction distances you from the source of your strength. The enemy wants to keep you disconnected, because as long as you're disconnected, you're vulnerable. He'll even use crisis to distract you. Not every storm in your life is meant to sink you. Some are meant to distract you. If the enemy can keep you focused on the storm, you'll forget the Savior in the boat. If he can keep you focused on the problem, you won't see the promise. That's the power of distraction. It doesn't need to destroy to be effective. It just needs to divide. Divide your attention, divide your faith, divide your focus, and the enemy knows your impact will shrink. Because double-minded people are unstable in all their ways, and instability makes you susceptible. When you lose focus, you lose footing. When you lose footing, you stop moving with authority. And when you stop moving with authority, the enemy no longer needs to push. You'll stumble on your own. One of the most overlooked aspects of spiritual warfare is how the enemy will use everyday situations to subtly draw your heart and mind away from what God is doing. His tactics don't always show up looking like temptation or obvious sin. Sometimes they come in the form of simple interruptions, minor frustrations, or emotional triggers. He's not always trying to defeat you outright. Often, he's just trying to distract you long enough so that you never engage in the battle to begin with. He wants to keep you reacting instead of responding, busy instead of purposeful, anxious instead of anchored. Because if he can keep you distracted, he doesn't need to fight you head on. He just lets your divided focus do the damage. When God gives direction, the enemy gives distraction. It's been that way from the beginning. As soon as clarity comes, confusion tries to creep in. As soon as purpose is revealed, resistance begins to stir. As soon as you say yes to God, everything around you will try to pull you back into the noise. This isn't coincidental, it's intentional. It's not random, it's strategic. The enemy understands timing. He knows when to throw interference. He waits until your heart is stirred, until your mind is made up, until your spirit is leaning forward. Then he strikes with something that feels urgent, something that demands your attention, something that forces you to shift your focus. That's why some of the greatest spiritual battles aren't about temptation. They're about attention. The enemy doesn't always try to lead you into rebellion. Sometimes he just wants to keep you in distraction, because distraction over time leads to disobedience. Not out of defiance, but out of neglect. You simply forget what God told you. You delay acting on His word. You allow other things to feel more pressing. The longer you stay distracted, the easier it is to convince yourself that maybe what God said wasn't that important after all. And in that space, compromise grows. Not because you're running from God, but because you're no longer walking with Him at the pace He set for you. One of the enemy's most effective weapons is overload. He floods your life with noise, with pressure, with choices, with comparison. He fills your schedule so full that there's no room left for seeking God. He fills your mind so full of problems and possibilities that there's no space left for peace. You begin to live reactive instead of responsive, driven instead of led. You get caught in a cycle of doing, chasing, fixing, and proving, all while slowly losing sight of who you are and whose you are. The enemy knows that a weary soul is easier to deceive, so he keeps you running, keeps you scrolling, keeps you striving. Anything to keep you from stillness, because stillness invites clarity. And clarity is dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. Distraction also thrives in offense. When your heart is wounded, when your spirit is bruised, the enemy moves in quickly. He doesn't want healing, he wants festering. He wants you to replay the hurt, rehearse the betrayal, relive the pain. Because as long as your mind is stuck in the offense, it can't move forward in purpose. Bitterness is one of the most powerful distractions because it feels justified. You convince yourself that your anger is your armor. But in reality, it's a chain. The longer you carry it, the heavier it becomes, and the harder it is to discern where God is leading. Offense clouds your vision. It narrows your focus to what went wrong instead of what God is doing right now. That's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants your faith stuck in yesterday, your mind locked in disappointment, and your heart closed off to possibility. Even ministry can become a distraction when it's not centered in obedience. You can be doing good things, sacrificial things, even biblical things, and still miss what God is asking of you in this moment. That's how subtle distraction can be. It's not always sin that pulls you off course. It's anything that shifts your center from God's presence to your own performance. You begin to measure your value by your output, your success by applause, your calling by the platform instead of the assignment. The enemy doesn't mind you doing ministry as long as your heart is disconnected from the Master. Because distracted ministry leads to dry wells. You pour out what you haven't received. You speak words you haven't heard. You give advice you haven't prayed through. And slowly, the effectiveness fades, even if the activity continues. The spiritual realm is not passive. Every day there are forces at work trying to either draw you closer to God's plan or pull you away from it. The battlefield is invisible, but the impact is real. Your mind is the front line. Your focus is the territory. And your obedience is the prize. That's why the enemy fights so hard to keep you distracted. Because he knows that if you ever get clarity, if you ever walk in full focus, if you ever tune out the noise and lock into what God is saying, nothing can stop what God will do through your life. The enemy often uses subtle forms of distraction because he knows how to take something small and turn it into something that completely diverts your course. He doesn't always have to bring catastrophe to sidetrack your life. All he has to do is present you with enough small interruptions, mental noise, or emotional confusion until you begin to live in a constant state of spiritual fog. You may still be going to church, still opening your Bible, still saying the right things, but your heart is no longer anchored in God's voice. You become more reactive than reflective, more hurried than holy, more scattered than surrendered. That's the enemy's goal, to keep you so preoccupied that you lose sight of your identity, your authority, and your assignment in the kingdom of God. He understands that a distracted believer is just as ineffective as a disobedient one. And the deception lies in how normal it all feels. Life keeps moving. Bills still need paying. Relationships need tending. Work demands attention. Everything is urgent, and in the whirlwind of activity, spiritual alertness begins to dull. You begin to rely more on instinct than intimacy, on planning more than praying. And without even realizing it, your pace is no longer dictated by God's presence, but by pressure. The enemy knows that when you are driven by pressure, you begin to compromise on rest, neglect spiritual renewal, and operate outside of divine timing. You begin to confuse momentum with movement, productivity with purpose. He also uses people to distract, not always through conflict, though he'll do that too, but sometimes just through influence. He'll place voices around you that sound wise but aren't speaking from the Spirit. He'll bring opinions, perspectives, and even advice that seem harmless but are quietly steering you away from what God has spoken. You begin to second-guess what you once were sure of. You delay decisions that God already gave clarity on. You start leaning more on consensus than conviction. That's how distraction can work through relationships. It doesn't always show up as someone toxic. Sometimes it's someone well-meaning who's just not assigned to speak into your season. The enemy doesn't care if the distraction feels supportive. He only cares that it detours your focus. Even fear is a powerful form of distraction. The enemy will raise up circumstances that trigger your anxiety, magnify your insecurities, or feed your doubts. You begin to question your calling, compare your journey, and settle for less than God's best simply because fear took center stage. When fear grabs your attention, faith begins to shrink. You stop praying boldly. You stop stepping forward. You stop dreaming. You shift from walking by faith to walking by calculation. You overanalyze, overthink, and undertrust. And all the while, the enemy is quietly pleased because your focus has shifted from the promises of God to the uncertainties of your situation. One of the most effective distractions is urgency. The enemy will use urgent matters to override important ones. You'll feel like everything needs your attention now, but not everything urgent is essential. Jesus understood this clearly. He never rushed, never panicked, never let the urgent needs around him distract from the eternal purpose within him. He didn't heal everyone. He didn't respond to every demand. He moved according to the Father's timing, not people's expectations. That's the kind of spiritual focus the enemy wants to keep you from. Because when you walk in that kind of clarity, your life becomes a threat to the darkness. Another method the enemy uses is guilt. He reminds you of your failures, throws your past in your face, and attempts to convince you that you're disqualified. He knows if you're preoccupied with shame, you won't walk in grace. Guilt is a distraction from the freedom you've already been given. It anchors your mind in what was instead of what is. And as long as your attention stays on your past, you'll never fully embrace your purpose. The enemy doesn't even need to attack your future. If he can trap you in your yesterday, you'll keep trying to fix what God already forgave. You'll keep trying to prove what God already declared. And in the process, you'll be distracted from living in the fullness of your identity as a child of God. Sometimes the distraction comes through comfort. The enemy will lull you into spiritual complacency by making life feel easy enough that you don't feel a need to press in, pray deeper, or seek more. You settle into routines, stop challenging yourself spiritually, and become passive about growth. Comfort can be just as dangerous as chaos when it comes to distracting you from God's will. Because when you're comfortable, you stop stretching. When you stop stretching, you stop growing. And when you stop growing, you stop depending on God. The enemy knows how to turn ease into a prison, how to use satisfaction as a snare, how to make settling look like wisdom when it's really fear in disguise. The enemy's distractions are not just about diverting your attention. They're about diluting your spiritual strength. He knows that if he can get you to spread yourself too thin, pour yourself out in too many directions, and become consumed with things that don't feed your spirit, your inner fire will begin to fade. That's his aim, not just to slow you down, but to drain you dry. He doesn't need to get you to quit outright. He just needs you tired enough to stop fighting, confused enough to stop hearing, and distracted enough to stop moving forward in obedience. When you lose focus, you lose energy. When you lose energy, you lose momentum. And when you lose momentum, your purpose becomes something you remember instead of something you walk in daily. The distraction often begins with what feels like responsibility. You say yes to a few more things. You take on a few more roles. You try to be everything to everyone. But in doing so, you lose the simplicity and clarity that comes from walking closely with God. You start carrying weight He never asked you to carry. You start solving problems He never told you to fix. You start chasing goals that may be good, but not God assigned. And as a result, your soul begins to strain under the load of a life that's overcommitted and underprayed. The enemy wants to keep your life full, but your spirit empty. He wants you so caught up in activity that you no longer hear the quiet whisper of God's leading. Even in the moments you do slow down, He's there, waiting to fill the silence with noise. Instead of drawing near to God, you reach for your phone. Instead of resting in God's presence, you turn on the television. Instead of sitting in stillness, you start scrolling through someone else's life. This isn't coincidence. The enemy will use anything that numbs you, distracts you, or entertains you just long enough to keep you disconnected from divine intimacy. He understands that a moment of silence with God can break strongholds, restore clarity, and recalibrate your spirit. That's why he'll fight so hard to keep your life loud and your mind noisy. He doesn't need to attack you if he can simply distract you long enough that your hunger for God is slowly replaced with spiritual apathy. Sometimes the distraction comes in the form of chasing validation. The enemy will have you running after the applause of people instead of the approval of God. You'll start living for likes instead of living by faith. You'll start measuring your value by your visibility. You'll feel the need to prove yourself, to perform, to maintain an image. And before you know it, you're no longer following God's voice. You're following people's expectations. The danger here is that the more you chase validation, the more you lose your authenticity. You become a version of yourself crafted for public consumption instead of a vessel shaped in private devotion. And all of that is a form of distraction. Because when you're performing, you're not transforming. Another tool the enemy uses is conflict. He'll stir up strife in your relationships, send misunderstandings into your friendships, plant seeds of offense in your heart. And before long, you're spending your time and energy on drama instead of destiny. You're fighting battles that don't even belong to you, emotionally drained by arguments that have nothing to do with your assignment. That's how the enemy works. He wants to exhaust your heart so there's nothing left to give to the people and places that really matter. When you're consumed with conflict, you can't walk in clarity. When your heart is cluttered with offense, your ears can't discern God's instructions. That's why He sows division, not just to break relationships, but to block revelation. And one of the most effective forms of distraction is the constant comparison that comes from watching other people's lives. The enemy will use what you see to distort how you see yourself. You start to feel like you're behind. You start to wonder if God forgot you. You begin to question whether your pace is too slow, your progress too small, your gifts too quiet. But what you don't realize is that distraction has turned into deception. You've been so focused on someone else's chapter that you've lost sight of your own assignment. Comparison kills contentment, and contentment is the soil where peace and purpose grow. When your eyes are fixed on what God is doing for others, they can't be focused on what He's asking from you. Even weariness can be a distraction. The enemy knows when you've been through a season of heavy battles, and that's when he tries to wear you down. Not with one big hit, but with constant resistance. A delay here, a disappointment there, a door that doesn't open, a prayer that doesn't seem answered. Little by little, hope begins to fade, and as hope fades, your passion follows. That's when you start settling for survival instead of stepping into victory. The enemy loves to see you worn out because tired believers stop dreaming. Tired believers stop expecting. Tired believers lower their standards and shrink their faith. And that's exactly what he wants. Believers who are too weary to keep fighting for what God has already promised, the enemy doesn't need to destroy your faith if he can distract it. He doesn't always come through the front door with obvious attacks. More often, he slips through the side windows of your routine, your thoughts, your habits. He brings just enough interference to keep you from locking in to what God is really saying. He knows that if he can keep you busy, bothered, or burdened, then you won't be still enough to discern the voice of God clearly. And when you can't hear God clearly, you'll begin to lean on your own understanding. That's where the distraction takes root. The goal isn't always to get you to rebel. Sometimes the goal is just to make you rely on yourself more than you rely on your Savior. That shift in reliance is where things begin to unravel. It doesn't always feel wrong at first. In fact, it might even feel productive. You're working harder, staying up later, trying to manage everything. But all of it is a trap designed to make you carry what God never asked you to carry. Distraction leads to misplaced weight. You start taking on burdens, expectations, opinions, and pressures that pull you away from peace. You become overwhelmed, not because life is too much, but because you're handling it apart from God's grace. The enemy is hoping you'll stay in that cycle, too busy to pray, too anxious to hear, too tired to fight. And when you're in that state, you're more likely to make decisions based on emotion instead of revelation. He doesn't stop at external distractions either. He will work to hijack your internal world. He will speak lies to your mind, stir up insecurity, and use subtle reminders of past failures to steal your present confidence. You'll be right on the edge of obedience, ready to step into something God called you to, and suddenly you'll be flooded with doubt, hesitation, and fear. Those are not random thoughts. They are strategic distractions. Because the enemy knows that if he can make you question yourself, you'll second guess what God already confirmed. He doesn't have to build a wall to stop you. He just has to plant enough uncertainty to make you stop yourself. Distraction also comes through emotional entanglements. He'll send relationships that feel right but pull you out of rhythm with God. He'll use the fear of being alone to get you to connect with people who aren't aligned with your calling. He'll make it seem like compromise is a necessary sacrifice for companionship, but every relationship isn't a divine assignment. Some are demonic appointments dressed in temporary comfort. The enemy knows if he can tie your heart to the wrong people, he can block your ability to hear from the right source. You'll be too emotionally invested in keeping someone that you'll ignore the warning signs God is placing right in front of you. That's how powerful distraction through relationships can be. It clouds your judgment and dulls your discernment. He also loves to use regret and nostalgia as tools of distraction. He'll remind you of what you lost, what didn't work out, what you could have done differently. And while you're stuck looking back, life is moving forward. The danger in regret is that it can dress itself up as reflection. But there's a difference between learning from the past and living in it. The enemy knows that as long as your attention is fixed on what was, you won't have the clarity to step into what is. He wants to keep your focus behind you so that you never experience the new thing God is doing in front of you. Even your strengths can become a distraction when you begin to depend on them instead of depending on God. The enemy will allow you to succeed just enough to believe you don't need help. He'll let you get a few wins in your own power, so you start leaning on your talent instead of leaning on God's presence. But what you built without Him, you'll have to maintain without Him. And eventually the weight of that becomes unbearable. The enemy's distraction through self-sufficiency is one of the most deceptive because it looks like confidence on the outside, but is often rooted in fear on the inside. The fear that if you stop striving, everything will fall apart. Sometimes the distraction is simply survival. The enemy wants to keep you so focused on getting through the day, solving the next crisis, handling the next demand, that you forget you were made for more than just making it. He wants you to shrink your life down to the level of your problems, instead of lifting your eyes to the level of your promise. When your eyes are always on the immediate, you lose sight of the eternal. That's what distraction does. It keeps your head down when God is calling you to look up. It keeps you focused on what's temporary when you're called to impact what's eternal. It's not that you don't want to obey. It's that you're too overwhelmed to see what God is asking in the first place. The enemy studies patterns. He watches your rhythms, your responses, your weaknesses, and your desires. He doesn't just throw anything at you randomly. He targets you with precision. That's why his distractions feel so personal. They speak directly to the places where you're most vulnerable, most tired, or most uncertain. He doesn't just aim to distract you once. He aims to build a lifestyle around distraction so that you begin to live in a constant state of divided focus. When your focus is divided, your direction is unstable. And when your direction is unstable, you waste energy moving without purpose, fighting battles you were never called to fight, and carrying weights you were never meant to bear. He understands the danger of your focus. He knows that when you are clear on who you are, what God said, and where you're going, there is very little he can do to stop you. So instead of attacking your strength, he attacks your attention. He bombards your day with minor irritations, unexpected stress, or relational tension. He fills your nights with thoughts that won't settle and fears that won't quiet down. He whispers questions that make you doubt the clarity you had yesterday. Slowly but steadily, you start to lose the sharpness of your vision. You don't even realize it's happening because the changes are gradual. You think you're just tired, just busy, just distracted for a season. But that season stretches, and distraction becomes a new normal. The enemy will distract you through delay. He'll convince you that you have time, that there's no rush to obey, that you can wait a little longer before taking the step God told you to take. But delayed obedience becomes disobedience when the delay is driven by fear, doubt, or comfort. He knows that procrastination, when repeated long enough, becomes paralysis. You'll have the desire to do God's will but lack the drive to act on it. You'll speak about purpose but live in hesitation. That's how distraction steals destiny, not by direct attack but by indirect delay. The moment you hesitate on God's instruction, the enemy steps in with alternatives. He'll give you options, distractions that look reasonable, detours that seem harmless, and suggestions that don't look sinful but subtly pull you off the path of faith. Distraction also thrives in environments of confusion. When you're unsure of what God is doing, the enemy tries to fill in the blanks. He starts offering interpretations of your circumstances, explanations for your delays, and assumptions about God's silence. He turns uncertainty into unrest and uses the unknown to plant fear. If he can get you to obsess over what you don't know, you'll forget what you do know. You'll become so consumed with unanswered questions that you stop walking in the answers God has already given. That's the power of distraction. It magnifies confusion and minimizes conviction. It inflates your doubts and shrinks your confidence in what God spoke over your life. He also uses emotional weight to distract. He knows that unresolved emotions can pull more energy from you than external situations ever could. He'll bring back old wounds, stir up suppressed anger, reignite shame, and make you feel stuck in emotional patterns that drain your joy. When your emotional world is in chaos, your spiritual ears go quiet. You don't feel like praying, you don't want to worship, and you can't find the strength to stand in truth. Emotional distraction makes you reactive rather than rooted. Instead of standing on the Word, you're constantly trying to stabilize your feelings. And when you live by feelings, your faith will always fluctuate. He often works through distraction in seasons of transition. Right when God is moving you from one level to another, from one season to the next, the enemy turns up the volume. He wants to make you so focused on what you're leaving that you don't prepare for where you're going. He'll remind you of what was, stir up fear about what's next, and try to keep you entangled in what's familiar. That's because transitions are dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. Every time you step into a new level of faith, obedience, or authority, the enemy loses ground. So he fights to keep you stuck in between, no longer where you were, but not quite where you're called to be. And if you stay distracted during transition, you'll miss the preparation God is doing in you for the next assignment. The enemy also uses spiritual fatigue. He wants you to keep pushing in your own strength until your spiritual disciplines become mechanical. You're reading the word but not absorbing it. You're showing up to worship but your heart is distant. You're praying but not expecting. That spiritual fatigue becomes a doorway for deeper distraction. You start coasting, relying on routine rather than relationship. You tell yourself you're doing enough because the outward activity is still there, but inwardly you're drifting. The enemy isn't threatened by religious routine. He's threatened by real intimacy with God. So he'll do whatever he can to keep you distracted from returning to that place of deep personal connection. He wants your life so cluttered that you don't notice you're missing the presence of God. He wants you so overwhelmed that you think burnout is just part of the process. He wants you so numbed by routine that you lose your hunger for more. That's what distraction does. It doesn't scream, it erodes. It doesn't shout lies. It whispers just enough noise to make truth harder to hear. And when truth is hard to hear, faith becomes hard to live.